first time I heard it, I thought some wretched thing had torn loose from the reef. A single bellow rolled across the palms, too deep for any bull and too long for any man. The lantern glass shook, the sand at my feet shivered, and all the night insects ceased as if a hand had closed upon the island. Then, from the black line of the trees, something answered it in a wet, shuddering breath. Men have asked me to recount this, to set it down plain while my memory still holds. If you would hear the rest, lend your support and leave your thoughts below that others may weigh them. There is more than one truth in what follows. It began 3 weeks earlier, when the sea still seemed sufficient explanation for every fear. On the 3rd of June, 1899, our cutter from Nukuʻalofa made the outer reef of Fangasito, a low islet in the Ha'apai group where the company had secured rights to harvest copra. I had come as clerk and tallyman with a cheap German sextant, a brass chronometer that had gained 3 seconds on the passage, and a head full of ledgers. I trusted numbers more than tales. There were 7 of us. Peterson, the Danish overseer, tall and red from the sun, who had spent 10 years among the islands and spoke the Tongan tongue better than I. Vaya and his cousin Latu, both from Lefuka, strong men with quick smiles when we first landed. Old Sione, who handled the small whaleboat and watched the weather more than he watched men. 2 younger hands, Finau and Kepu, and myself, the only European besides Peterson. We set up our camp above the spring where the palms began. Our canvas bell tent held the stores, us while the men stretched sennet between breadfruit trunks for their sleeping mats. The air was heavy with salt and rotting palm fronds, warm even after sundown. Mosquitoes whined incessantly, but we had kerosene lamps and coils of poor tobacco. And that first night we passed the pipe in a circle and spoke of homes we had left. I remember that early talk as clearly as the later horror. Peterson spoke of snow in Jutland as if it were some legend. The Tongans laughed to imagine water falling frozen from the sky. Vaya showed me a little carved whale he kept in his pouch, made by his eldest son. I told them of my father's shop in Auckland, of the smell of tar and wet rope, of the heavy bell that marked the end of the day. We were, for a brief time, simply men upon a job. The work began in earnest with the dawn. The palms on Fangasito grew thick and old. Fallen nuts littered the ground, sprouting blindly where they lay. We cut, husked, split, and laid the meat to dry on raised platforms of rough timber, measuring by the fathom. The first 2 days passed without more trouble than a squall and 1 centipede bite. The island seemed no different from others I had seen. The first small thing occurred on the 3rd day. We had gone inland to mark a new line of palms, following a faint pig track through the undergrowth. The air under the canopy felt close, the light green and heavy. I walked ahead with my compass, the cheap needle trembling. It was then I saw the impressions in a bare strip of soil between the roots. At first, I thought them pig tracks, for pigs had been turned loose long ago on most of these islets. But these marks were longer, more narrow, with the suggestion of 2 broad toes where the weight had sunk deepest. Each was the length of my forearm from elbow to wrist. The distance between them made no sense. They appeared at regular intervals, as though something had taken great, measured strides, and then they simply ceased upon a patch of coral rubble where no soft earth waited. I called Peterson to see. He squatted, ran his thick fingers along the margin of one print, and laughed. "Some fellow has played you a trick, Clark," he said, "or the pig was very well shod." The others came, peered without speaking. Latu crossed himself in the old Catholic fashion he had learned from the fathers in Uvea. When I asked him what he thought, he merely said, "We should keep to the shore for the cutting tar," and that was all. I told myself the marks were distortions, not the result of water and slipping hoof, and we went on. Yet that evening, as the sun sank behind the palms, I heard Vaya murmur something to Sayone in their own tongue, low and quick. I caught the word Tukuʻakahi and nothing more. When they realized I listened, they fell silent. I did not press the point. Men have their island notions, I told myself. It was no business of mine. We heard the first sound that same night. It came long after the lamps were doused, when the stars burned hard and bright, and the lagoon lay like ink. I lay upon my mat, sweat collecting in the hollows of my collarbones, despite the faint breeze. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked twice, and then yelped, cut short. There followed a deep, distant booming, as though some colossal drum had been struck beneath the sea. It did not come from the reef, and that was the odd thing. It seemed to rise under the very ground, to vibrate through the husk piles and the empty casks and my own bones. The canvas lantern chimed against its hook. After the third of these booms, an absolute stillness settled that was more dreadful than the noise. The surf did not lessen, yet I could not hear it. The leaves did not cease to move, yet I could not hear them. My own breath sounded indecently loud. Earth tremor, I told myself. Some underwater disturbance. It was sensible, and yet the explanation sat badly. When at last the night sounds crept back, they did so hesitantly, as if unwilling. In the morning, we found the dog. It had belonged to Finau, a scrawny yellow creature that had followed us from Lifuka. We discovered it lying stiff beside the pandanus that mark the path to the spring. There was no blood, no tearing. Its tongue hung blackened, swollen far past the teeth, as though some great heat had seized it in a single instant. The men exchanged glances and said nothing. As the days went on, the work grew heavier and our tempers shorter. The heat did not lessen instead. Odd pockets of chill seemed to creep into the groves. You would be walking beneath the palms, shirt sticking to your back, when you would pass through a band of air as cold as if it had blown across snow. It would last for 3 steps, no more, and leave the hairs on your arms lifted, your teeth on edge. Twice I tried to mark such a patch upon my crude map, noting the trees, the lay of the ground. When I walked back to the same place, the air felt ordinary. I began to say nothing, and to drink more of the thin rum Peterson kept in a case at the edge of camp. The men grew quieter. Where they had sung as they husked, they now worked in near silence. At night, they kept the lamps burning later, their faces turned toward the tree line rather than the sea. Once, near the end of the first week, I woke to find that the usual insect chorus had ceased again. This time there was no booming, only a long, drawn-out creak from the direction of the interior, like an ancient mast twisting in a gale, yet the air in the tent lay perfectly still. It was on the 10th day that the seabirds left. I had grown used to their cries, to the endless circling of terns and frigates above the outer reef. That morning the sky looked oddly bare. I marked it, but did not understand its weight. Only later did I learn that it was the last ordinary morning I would ever know. The second unmistakable sign came that afternoon. We had extended our drying racks farther along the shore, closer to a patch of bush that leaned over the lagoon. I carried a ledger and a stick of charcoal, counting rows of split copra. The sun beat upon the white meat, throwing back a glare that watered my eyes. I stepped into the shade of the bushes for a moment to ease my head. The air there felt wrong at once. The heat dropped from me in a single breath, as if I had entered a stone cellar. My skin prickled. An odor hung between the leaves, neither wholly animal nor wholly rot. It reminded me of the bilge of a ship that has carried something alive too long in cramped quarters. There was musk in it, and an old saltiness, and something faintly sweet that turned my stomach. From deeper in the greenery there came a sound, soft but deliberate, like a slow exhalation drawn over a gravelly throat. I stepped back into the light at once. The chill left me, but the smells seemed to trail after, clinging to the inside of my nose. When I turned, I saw that some low fronds bore marks I had not noticed when we had first cut through. Long, parallel grooves, as if seized by an immense hand with many fingers and pulled downwards. The fibers had frayed but not snapped. I told Peterson. He shrugged, though I saw the little pulse leap in his temple. "Crabs," he said, grinning too broadly. "Big coconut crabs, Clark. They climb and pull. That is all." "That is not a crab's work," I replied. "Then a man's. One of them trying to frighten you. Do not let them. The company pays for dried meat, not superstition." That night, he drank more heavily than before. I heard him mutter in his own tongue, a prayer, perhaps, or a curse. By the 12th day, we had begun to range farther inland for better nuts. A faint path led toward the heart of the island, where the palms thinned and low ferns took their place. We followed it in single file, chopping the occasional creeper. The light came down more cleanly there, in shafts that showed every drifting mote. Halfway along that path, at a point I could now walk to blindfolded from any direction, my pocket chronometer stopped. I noticed it when Peterson asked me for the time. I drew it from my vest, flicked it open, and saw both hands arrested at 11 minutes past 2. The ticking had ceased. I shook it, but the balance wheel refused to move. I wound it, the key turned, but nothing caught, and the hairs at the nape of my neck rose without cause that I could have named. "Broken?" asked Peterson. "It had been keeping good time," I said. Old Sione, who seldom offered opinion, spat into the leaf mold and said very quietly, in English for my benefit, "Some places do not wish to be measured, Ta." I laughed because I had no answer. The men did not. We went on, but there was a new stiffness in our line. The ferns brushed our legs with a whisper like breath. That evening brought the first real break in our composure. The work had run late, and dusk came down faster than we liked. We hurried the last baskets under cover as the western sky went purple behind the palms. The lagoon darkened by degrees, and I had just entered the tent to light the main lantern when the world dropped into a silence so complete that the hiss of the match sounded like a gunshot. The flame flared and then dwindled, crawling down the stick without catching the wick. I tried again. The second match did the same, its light stuttering as if smothered by some unseen current. Outside, I heard a single cry from Finau, short and wordless. On the third attempt, the lantern burst into sudden brightness. At that precise instant, there came a thundering crash from the far-drying racks, as of heavy timber overturned. The ground shook beneath my feet. I stumbled out, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. The nearest racks lay undisturbed, their neat rows glimmering. But 30 yards farther, at the place nearest the tree line, one of the great frames lay canted upon its side. The split coconuts had spilled like bleached bones across the sand. Of the support posts, one still stood. One had snapped cleanly, and the third had been wrenched from the ground and hurled several yards away. The hole it left behind was deep and ragged, as if something with immense leverage had simply plucked it out. "Wind," said Peterson, though the air lay heavy and without movement. His voice rasped. The wood was rotten. "The pegs were sound," said Latu in his low way. He pointed to the snapped end. The fibers within were pale and fresh, torn obliquely as though twisted. We set the rack upright again with many hands and few words. That night, no one slept early. The men sat with their backs together, eyes on the dark. Once or twice someone muttered Tukuʻakahi, and the name moved through them like a shiver. I asked its meaning at last. Sione looked at me as a man looks at a child who has asked why the sea does not spill from the world's edge. "It is older than the name," he said. "It is the first one that walks. Do not call it Ta. It hears." I found myself, absurdly, checking the priming on the old Snyder rifle that we kept propped by the tent. The metal felt cool and solid under my fingers, a small island of reason. Thereafter, everything seemed to lean toward that one central presence, though we still had not seen it. The pockets of cold increased. The smell in the interior grew stronger, seeping outward until we caught it even near the shore when the wind fell. Once, as we worked, a flock of small island doves rose from the grove in a single explosive flight, their wings drumming. They passed low over our heads toward the sea and did not return all that day. The men began to speak of leaving. Peterson resisted, torn between profit and a caution he would not admit. "We are nearly at our quota," he insisted. "2 more weeks, and we shall have the holds of 3 cutters filled. The company will not thank us if we run for home now, because a few birds choose another tree." Yet his eyes strayed often toward the interior. He kept his pipe unlit, the stem chewed to ruin. The first partial sighting came on the 14th day, and it belonged not to me, but to Vaya. He had gone inland alone to check a line of palms where the nuts had been slower to fall. When he did not return by midday, Peterson sent Latu and me to fetch him. We had nearly reached the stand when we heard it, a rustling ahead, followed by a hoarse cry that I knew as Vaya's voice, half choked. We hurried our pace. The undergrowth here rose almost to the hip, and it grabbed at our trousers. As we broke into the small clearing around the chosen palms, we saw him. He stood with his back against a trunk, machete dangling loose from his hand. His chest heaved. His gaze was fixed upon a point in the foliage to our left, where the light lay shattered in green and gold. I followed his stare. Something moved there, behind the layered leaves. I did not see a whole form, only impressions. A curve that might have been shoulder or haunch, far too high from the ground to belong to a man. A faint suggestion of pallor in the gloom, not white like European skin, nor brown like the islanders, but a sort of hued grey that reminded me, absurdly, of weathered bone. Between 2 great palm roots, I saw an expanse of ground where the dead fronds lay thick. They pressed downward under some invisible weight, then slowly rose again as that weight shifted. A smell came with the movement, heavy and close, filling my nose and mouth with its cloying salt musk and a bitter taint like old smoke. My stomach clenched. The The machete in my own hand suddenly felt useless, a toy. The leaves shivered once, from the ground upward as though brushed by a rising body, and then there was nothing. The impression of mass withdrew, with a soft, drawn-out susurration. The light filtered through empty air again. Latu crossed himself and said something in Tongan that I could not catch. Vaya did not move until I touched his arm. It watched me, he whispered, when at last he spoke English. I did not hear it come. I felt it. It was like the reef when a great wave passes outside. It is wrong to be here, Ta. It knows our number. We brought him back, and the story spread through the camp without words. The men looked to Peterson. For the first time, he did not meet their eyes. 3 more days, he said finally. We shall finish this section and take what we have. There is weather brewing besides, and I do not like the set of the swell. 3 days, and then we shall see. Those 3 days were longer than any season of my life. The signs multiplied. Each night brought the deep booming, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, as if the source circled the island below the surface of rock and coral. Once, in the early hours, I woke from a shallow doze to hear my own name spoken in a voice that was not any of the men's. It came from outside the tent, low and oddly high at once, and my syllables drawn out and mangled as though by a mouth unaccustomed to such work. "Raichard," it said, with a sucking pause in the middle. I lay rigid, heart hammering, listening. After a long moment, the same voice repeated the word in Tongan that the men used for me. Ta, this time in perfect cadence. Then there was a sound like a hand upon the canvas, a slow stroke that brushed from one peg to another. The fabric did not move. My skin crawled so that I felt flayed. In the morning, there were no marks upon the tent. I said nothing. So did they. The animals fled altogether on the 17th day. We rose at dawn to find not a single pig rooting near the outer groves, no sign of the small lizards that had once basked upon the rocks. Even the tiny crabs that burrowed at the tide line had vanished, leaving only their empty holes, and the island felt hollowed. By this time, even Peterson conceded that we must go. The sky to the east had taken on a flat, ominous glare, the edge of some distant storm. We spent the day packing the most valuable of the dried copra, rolling casks toward the beach. Every noise seemed magnified. Once, as Finau and Kepu wrestled a barrel through the sand, we heard a sharp report from the interior, like a thick branch breaking under great strain. Both men dropped their load and ran to the open, faces ashen. That night was our last upon Fangasito, though we did not know it in those terms. We had intended one more dawn's work before the cutter returned. Instead, the island chose for us. It began with the horn of the conch. The men sometimes called to one another with a conch shell in the day, its note carrying well over the surf. This sound, however, did not come from any hand of theirs. It sounded shortly after full dark, rising from the interior in a long, wavering blast that held more breath than any human lung could manage. It was neither wholly like the conch, nor wholly unlike it, as though something had found the shell and learned the general method without comprehending the restraint. "Who is that?" I called, stepping from the tent, lantern held high. The men stood already in a tight knot near the racks, their faces turned toward the black mass of the inner grove. Their tools lay abandoned where they had been dropped. No one held a shell. Again the note rose, nearer now, joined by a rustling, a crashing of undergrowth. It was coming toward us. "We go to the boat," said Siona, with a calm that belied his eyes. "Now, Ta, do not run. It will follow if we run." Peterson began to speak of remaining, of foolishness, but when the third call sounded, so near that my teeth ached with it, his words failed. He seized the rifle and the box of cartridges, and we all moved as one toward the shore, walking quickly, but not breaking into a run, as Sione had ordered. The path to the whaleboat ran between two stands of smaller palms. To our left lay the drying racks. To our right, the first fringe of deeper bush. As we passed that place, the air grew again astonishingly cold. Breath plumed before our faces like faint smoke. The lantern flame guttered sideways, though no visible wind blew. From the darkness among the trunks, just beyond the reach of our light, something moved in tandem with us. I felt it more than saw it at first, the way one senses a presence at the back of a hall. Then the lantern light, swinging, caught upon something pale and vast between two trees. It might have been a flank or a folded limb. It glistened, slightly damp, as if fresh from the sea, though no water lay nearer than the lagoon. Beneath that pallor there were darker ridges, layered as though with old scars or some natural corrugation. A faint sound reached us, a deep-chested, labouring breath that came not from above, as a man's would, but low to the ground, as if some enormous barrel rolled and flexed with each inhalation. I raised the lantern higher, though every instinct in me screamed to lower it. For the first and only time, my light fell upon what I took to be part of its face. Not the whole, never the whole. A sweep of skin, not scaled like a fish, nor furred like a pig, but smooth and thick, with a strange bluish cast beneath the grey, a suggestion of a socket, large and empty as an abalone shell, above a fold of flesh where something like a mouth might lie. The impression of depth there was wrong, as if that cavity went back too far into the head. Within it, I saw not an eye, but layers of some darker tissue, as though the eye had sunk inward, drawn into the skull. The mouth fold twitched. A rush of foul air washed over us, that same mingling of salt and rot and old fire, so dense it seemed almost visible. It spoke then, in a fashion. Not words this time, but a low, gurgling syllable that rose and fell in a pattern like the chant I had heard once in a Tongan church. It was very nearly singing. Kepu broke. With a strangled cry, he turned and ran toward the beach, dropping his bundle. The thing moved at once. The sand to our right heaved as if ploughed from beneath. A great furrow opened in parallel ridges toward the fleeing man, the tops of the waves of sand catching the lantern glare. There was no visible limb above the surface, only the disturbance itself, as if an immense body swam through the earth as through water. "Do not run," shouted Sione again, but it was too late. Kepu stumbled, fell forward, and in that moment the leading ridge caught up to him. He vanished up to the waist in a single, smooth motion, with no spray of sand, no splash, only a dry, sucking sound. His arms flailed once above the surface, fingers clawing at nothing. Then he was gone. The furrow passed on, subsided, leaving the ground tamped and smooth, as though pressed by some enormous weight. I think someone fired the rifle. I recall a deafening report. The smell of powder, a brief flare. If the bullet struck anything but bark, there was no sign. The thing did not cry out. It did not bleed. It only withdrew a little, enough that the pressure in the air eased, and we could again hear the far-off surf. We did not walk after that. We ran, all of us, reasoning be damned, stumbling in a ragged line along the last stretch of path. I expected at every step to feel the ground open under me, to be dragged down as Kepu had been. Somehow, we reached the boat. It lay already straining at its painter, nose into the spill of the tide. The conch note sounded again behind us now, from very near the camp. This time, nearer the sea, it mingled with another noise, lower, more resonant, like the grinding of stones under great pressure. The very angle of the palms seemed to lean toward it. We tumbled into the boat with no order, pushing off even as Finau hacked through the rope. The keel grated on the coral sand, then lifted. Peterson and I seized the oars, pulling in short, desperate strokes, more to place any water at all between us and the shore than from plan. The lagoon was mercifully calm, the swell barely a breath. Behind us, on the fringe of the island, the line of palms wavered in the lantern light as though something enormous pressed among their roots. From that greater darkness, one final sound reached us, thin with distance but unmistakably shaped by intention. It spoke one of the old Tongan phrases of farewell, the one used for voyagers who may not return. Vaya whimpered and covered his ears. I understood then that we had ceased to be simply intruders. We had been recognized, measured, and dismissed. We pulled for the outer reef for what felt like hours, though later the men swore it was less than 30 minutes. The stars wheeled deliberately overhead. Once, as we crossed the line where the lagoon floor dropped away, the boat shifted as if some great swell passed beneath from shore to open ocean. There was no visible wave, only a rise and fall that set the thwarts creaking. We saw no luminous eyes in the water, no monstrous bulk breaking the surface. That, perhaps, made it worse. Whatever moved from Fangasito into the deep did so without deigning to show itself. At dawn, the cutter appeared as a small smudge on the eastern horizon and grew, canvas bellies swelling. The mate hailed us in surprise, for we should not have been waiting so far out. When we came alongside, sunburnt, wild-eyed, one man fewer, we told him there had been an accident, that Kepu had been taken by some concealed sinkhole near the grove. It was the first of many lies. Back in Nuku'alofa, we made our report to the company agent. The written account lists a death by misadventure, some damage to equipment in a sudden squall, and a premature end to the harvest due to unforeseen meteorological conditions. There is no mention of Tukuʻakahi. No ledger can bear such an entry. Among ourselves, in those first months, we tried at times to speak of it. The words always failed. How does a man lay out for examination something that can move unseen through earth and water, that can speak his name in his own voice? Each of us remembered different fragments. Afai now recalled the smell above all. Latu swore he had felt the drag of some unseen current upon his ankles as we ran. Peterson, who had stood nearest the thing when I raised the lantern, never again described what he had seen of that withered socket. He drank harder. 3 years later, I heard that he had been lost overboard in a storm between Vava'u and Uvea. Men said a sudden wave had swept him away. I have often wondered if he felt, that last instant, the same peculiarly deliberate lift and fall that had passed under our little boat as we fled Fangasito. In official circles, the island remained on company charts, its palms marked with neat hachures. There was talk, more than once, of sending another party. Each time something intervened, a cyclone that scoured the Hapai, a shortage of able men, a more profitable prospect closer to Tonga Tapu. I watched these delays with a private, guilty relief. I cannot say whether they were mere chance. Years passed. The world changed in small ways and great. Steamers came to the islands more often. Wireless masts rose here and there. I married. I had a son of my own who learned to read my ledgers and clambered over bales on the wharf. Yet Fangasito, and that nameless weight in its heart, never went far from me. Every now and then, some small, ordinary moment would crack and let that other presence rush through. Once, walking along the Auckland waterfront in winter, I passed an alley where the chills seemed suddenly absolute, colder than the wind off the harbour. For 3 steps, the air pressed in around me, bloodless. The smell of fish and tar vanished, replaced by a bare hint of that old musk and brine. I found myself stopping, heart racing, eyes on a patch of wet cobbles, as if expecting them to heave. On another occasion, in a boarding house in Sydney, I woke in the darkest hour to the sound of my own name spoken from the foot of the narrow bed. The voice was not so clear as on Fangasito, muddied by distance or time, but the cadence matched exactly that Longago night by the tent. The landlord later swore that no one had passed along the corridor at that hour. I lay awake until the dawn, watching the thin strip of light widen under the door, my throat raw with unshed words. 10 years after the island, I met Vaya again by chance on the wharf at Nuku'alofa. He had grown thicker in the middle, his hair touched with grey, but I knew his gait at once. We greeted each other in the old way. There was a brief moment when the easy talk of weather and wages faltered, and we both looked out toward the hazy line where the sea met the sky. "You remember," I said, and it needed no more detail. He nodded without turning his head. "At night," he replied, "when the wind goes down. If I listen too hard, I hear it walking under my house. I moved twice. It followed. I wanted to ask if he had told his children, whether he had given the old name to any of them. I did not. Some burdens are not to be inherited." Once, in an attempt to make sense of it all, I went to speak with a Tongan elder whose knowledge of the old stories was said to be considerable. I did not use the name Tukuʻakahi at first. I described only the signs. The pockets of cold, the vanishing tracks, the absence of creatures, the booming that rose from underfoot. As I spoke, now his lined face grew very still. "There are things," he said finally, "that were here when my father's father's father first named these reefs. We give them words so that we may speak around them. You have seen one of those words given body. Do not ask me to make it smaller for you, Palangi. My tongue is not that strong. I have kept my silence in writing until now. The company's copies of my reports rest in some moulding cabinet, full of neat columns and reassuring causes. To read only those, one would think Kepu died by his own misstep, and that we left Fangasito because of a minor storm. That version sits well in bound volumes. It harms no one and comforts most. This other account, the one you have just heard, sits less easily. I know that I cannot prove what I saw, or what moved beneath the sand. There were no photographs taken in that place, no precise measurements of those impossibly long prints, no samples of any tissue to examine under a glass. All we carried away were our memories and the subtle ways they have warped us. In the years since, I have stood upon many shores in different hemispheres, watching waves break and thinking of how thin the crust is upon which we walk. How little it would take for something older and more patient to shift, to rise a little nearer the light, to notice us. I have come, reluctantly, to accept that there are corners of the earth where no surveyor's chain will ever lie comfortably. If there is any solace, it is small. That thing, whatever name one gives it, did not pursue us into the deep. It could have, I am certain. There was a deliberation in its movement, a choice in that final farewell across the lagoon. It allowed us to go. Whether from disinterest or from some recognition of limits we do not understand, I cannot say. Unknowability may be the only boundary that still holds firm. What remains most vivid to me, after all these years, is not the half-glimpsed flank or the withered socket, nor even the sight of Kepu vanishing without a cry. It is something far smaller. As we rode for the cutter in that grey morning light, I looked back once over my shoulder. Fangasito lay low and green, innocent as any atoll. The line of the inner palms stood unmoving, just visible on the farthest of our drying racks, the one we had righted twice. A single strip of copra hung askew, though there was no wind, turning very slowly on a frayed fibre, as if an unseen breath still passed over it.